If you've been paying attention to where gaming technology is heading, you probably noticed that the conversation is starting to shift away from just raw power and towards smarter AI driven performance. And now a statement from Mark Cerny has made that shift impossible to ignore. According to Cerny, frame generation is something that should be seen at some point on PlayStation platforms. That's not a vague rumor or insider leak. That's coming directly from the architect behind PlayStation hardware. And when someone in that position talks about the future, it usually means the groundwork is already being laid. So let's talk about why this matters, because frame generation isn't just another incremental upgrade. It's a fundamental change in how performance can be delivered. Traditionally, your frame rate is limited by how many frames your system can render in real time. If your hardware can output 30 or 60 frames per second, that's your ceiling. But frame generation flips that idea on its head by using AI to create entirely new frames in between the ones that are actually rendered. The result is a much smoother experience without requiring the same level of raw GPU power. This technology has already been making waves on PC, especially through Nvidia's DLSS suite, where frame generation has allowed supported games to reach dramatically higher perceived frame rates. Now bring that idea over to consoles, and you start to see why this is such a big deal. On the PlayStation 5, one of the defining characteristics of this generation has been the constant trade-off between performance and visual quality. Almost every major game asks you to choose: do you want higher resolution and better graphical effects at 30 frames per second, or smoother gameplay at 60 frames per second with some visual compromises? That balancing act has become standard, but it's also a limitation. Frame generation has the potential to ease that compromise by allowing games to look better while still feeling smoother to play. And this is where things start to connect with what Sony is already doing. The company has invested heavily in its own upscaling technology known as PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, or PSSR. Upscaling improves image quality without demanding as much performance, and frame generation takes that concept even further by enhancing motion itself. When you combine those two ideas, you're looking at a future where consoles rely less on brute force and more on intelligent rendering techniques. Cerny's comments suggest that Sony is actively exploring that direction, and it lines up perfectly with the broader industry trend toward AI-assisted graphics. At the same time, it's important to understand that frame generation isn't a magic solution, at least not yet. On PC, it comes with trade-offs. One of the biggest concerns is input latency. Because the generated frames aren't directly tied to your inputs in the same way traditionally rendered frames are, there can be a slight delay in responsiveness. In slower cinematic games, that might not be noticeable, but in fast-paced or competitive experiences, it can make a real difference. There are also visual challenges like artifacts or inconsistencies in motion, especially in scenes with rapid movement or complex effects. These issues are improving over time, but they haven't been completely solved. And that's why Sony's implementation will matter so much. Consoles are built around consistency and ease of use. Players expect games to run smoothly without having to tweak settings or troubleshoot performance issues. So if frame generation is going to become part of the PlayStation ecosystem, it needs to be refined to the point where it feels seamless. It's not just about boosting frame rates, it's about maintaining responsiveness, visual clarity, and overall stability in a way that meets console expectations. Another key part of this conversation is where the technology will actually show up first. With the PlayStation 5 Pro already on the market, it feels like a question of if PlayStation will adopt frame generation, and more likely how far they'll push it. The Pro already represents a step forward in terms of performance and AI-assisted rendering, and it could serve as the ideal platform for introducing more advanced techniques like frame generation. At the same time, it's possible that Sony is looking even further ahead, treating the current generation as a stepping stone towards a more fully realized implementation in future hardware. There's also a bigger industry trend happening here that's impossible to ignore. The gap between console and PC gaming has been shrinking for years, and technology like frame generation are accelerating that process. Features that were once exclusive to high-end PC setups are gradually making their way into consoles, and as that continues, the distinction between the two platforms becomes less about capability and more about how you prefer to play. In many ways, we're moving toward a unified approach to gaming technology, where the same core innovations power experiences across different types of hardware. So when Mark Cerny talks about frame generation coming to PlayStation platforms, it's more than just an interesting quote. It's a clear indication of direction. It tells us that Sony is thinking beyond traditional performance metrics and looking at smarter, more efficient ways to deliver better experiences. It may take time, and there are still challenges to overcome, but the path forward is becoming easier to see. And honestly, that's what makes this moment so interesting. We're not just watching hardware get stronger, we're watching the entire philosophy of performance evolve. Frame generation represents a shift toward doing more with what you have, using intelligence and innovation instead of brute force alone. If Sony can bring that to PlayStation in a way that feels natural and responsive, it could redefine what we expect from console gaming. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want to go even deeper into where gaming is heading, check out my Patreon. My latest exclusive video dives into whether consoles and PCs are becoming the same, and it connects directly to everything we talked about here. Until next time, game on.